We move on to Janos' paper, Janos Mark Szakolczai, the entire name, right? Nothing
Yep.
new. The title is Nothing New in the West, Paralleling the Eternal Recurrence of Invisible and Miasmatic Enemies. Please keep to 15 minutes.
Yep, I will try. So now the title has changed, but it's something like that. But don't worry about it. That was a kind of a previous idea. Now, really, what I would like to talk about is this idea of the gestation of COVID as a war, which is something that has been picked up in a whole lot of governments, and I found it as something extremely striking. And I went through the paper in this, meaning that I found kind of randomly a book that gave me really an idea of what really we were heading towards, and this was quite astonishing for me, which is Eric Maria's Remarque book, which is being translated as All Quiet in the Western Front, same in Italian, practically the same title, which actually the original title in German is Nothing New in the West. And it was quite striking because I was quite reading about Agamben again. I was reading about, I can't remember her name now. What's her name? I can't remember her name, but it will pop up to my head, talking about kind of recurrence of this idea of war and exactly what is the consequence of war and how terrible the war is, not simply for the bombing, but the actual effect it might have over people. It was Simone Weil that I wanted to say. So the main thing that I noticed when I was reading this book, and I don't want to get too much into the book, but the main thing is it talks about terrible horrors, and every single page I was reading about this book struck me because when you read or you see a movie or you hear about World War I, every time you realize that, you know, the terrible thing about World War I is not simply World War I, but World War II happened 20 years later. So that always stick to my head. And the horrors that this writer was trying to describe, saying, and he did make a huge effect in Germany and the rest of Europe with his book, anti-war book, was that it was quite useless. And this because the war happened and it allegedly was worse than the first one for many reasons. So the question that I pose in the paper, and I still have quite an answer, is why use this rhetorical war? Why has this been used this way? And why have the governments used this so much and so vividly? And I make quite kind of reference of all the various politicians that have used this idea of wars, of this as being a war, the medics being the equivalent of military, the people that must behave in some kind of disciplined manner to sustain the horrors of that this is going to take place. So my impression was really that, and I'm trying to kind of jump into things, that there's something oddly malignant in the use of this. We used the idea of malignant normality, and it's really striking the way that these words were used. They're trying to terribly scare people, and they have been used especially for the measures they have implemented and kind of justified. And we all know the measures. I mean, we have this idea of everybody and everything must be closed. Curfew has been used by governments in almost, well, in many governments has been used. Till today in Florence, we're not managing to get rid of it. We have been granted an extra hour. Then we have images of people being cremated. In Italy, there was this TVs were talking about, we know there's so many people dying, we don't know how to cremate them all, we need to move them from one place to another. And in New York, they were talking about having these mass cremations. It's quite horrifying images that hopefully people are starting not to mention that more, but I'm sure they have stuck somewhere. And this is exactly Remarque's point, that these images, this horror of the war, the trenches, all these horrific aspects that war are and are going to stick to us for the rest of our lives. And he is haunted. When he wrote a book, he wrote a book in 1927. It was years after he returned home, and he apparently he came home and he couldn't get over what was happening. He wasn't sure. He was like, why am I feeling this? He couldn't find, he started working as a teacher in a school. He had to leave. He just was haunted by something he couldn't well describe. And finally he managed to let it out, some kind of excretion of all the pain he had. He put it into the novel. So the point that I'm trying to get to is this idea, first of all, that the war rhetoric is very powerful because it allows us to really get to the feeling that we need, there is a necessity of self-discipline. Now there's a few images that I wanted to show, but perhaps I'll just send them all to you. The idea really is that through the war, because of the war, the words that have been used, the boundaries, we talked a lot about liminality, the boundaries that were the normality, and this word is very odd, and I don't really know how to use it anymore, new normality or whatnot. The boundaries have been pushed forward, and of what the government can do, of what the government may allow. We all know what happened after 9/11. Airports became extremely secured, and there's no mention that we're going to get ever back. There's no mention that they're not going to check our bags, they're not going to scan us in our ways. Actually, this is increasing. And the impression I'm personally having is that the boundary has been pushed, this has happened, there's not going to go up, there's not going to be going back. Why? How can you justify going back? We all know the horrors that have happened. We all know the risks of what is going to happen if this happens again. Let's just be safe, better safe than sorry. So this is kind of the idea of also well, for example, the mask is in this very, very personally significant to me, because it has become an integral part of our society. It has incredibly become something that we must rely to and wear and fundamentally dispose of, constantly be reminded of in every instant. So the point that I'm trying to make there is that there is something very powerful shown constantly that we are led to wear, and at the same time find very difficult to take off. And this is Remarque's quote there, that he talks about the idea that we are trying to address, and his book was trying to address, and possibly my chapter was trying to address, to the idea that, yes, we have all been in war, we have not been bombed, and we have, well, not all, but most of us have survived. And even if we take the uniform off, something still will prevail. Even if we take the mask off and we all get back to our lives, we all been vaccinated and whatnot, something still will prevail. And then what I'm saying is, I'm not being cynical. I'm using just the impressions I had from the words that have been used by the government. You were talking about war. You have bombarded us with this images of war. We're the wreckage of this. So there's an image that I didn't mention in the article, but there's an artist that for me is incredibly striking. It's Otto Dix, and there's a picture of him. I don't know if Federica can load it for me. So this is the war according to Otto Dix, and I hope you can open it. I can even send you a link that you can see it on Google, because Google has loaded it. Just a sec, let me find the link for you.
I think we're seeing it, Janos.
You're seeing it, great, but this is in HD, so it's even better. And the point about this this image, among the other things, that the horrific images of it, one that really strikes me is there's a little person in the middle, and this is a scene. The central picture is a scene of horrific disaster, and I don't know, there's no words to describe the horrors of this, and obviously that's why probably there was the need of a painter here who could actually depict what he saw, and Otto Dix was part of the war. Allegedly, this is on the right, you see this person carrying a wounded soldier. This is a self-portrait of him. But what I'm interested in is in this figure in the middle of the actual painting. In the middle of the painting, we have this horrible scenery of something which is the aftermath of a war, and we see this figure standing, quite shaky looking, still wearing the gas mask on. And this is kind of what I perceive as central in this whole COVID pandemic situation, that even when it's all over, this is what we're surrounded of. And the person there is not capable of taking his mask off. He's not trusting anyone. He's terrified, he's scared, he's still there. We're not even sure if he's actually still alive, but if he is, he's there and he's all covered up. So this figure there is central for me, even with the idea of the soldier. And this is, again, Remarque talks a lot about this. He went to war when he was 17, and then 18, he went to the front. He talks about when he's describing the book, the last years of the war, actually he's witnessing 60-year-olds coming to war, and he's like, yeah, these are the people gonna die, like 1 day, 2 days. Like, they don't even get the chance to actually fight, because there's just gonna be, they don't know the rules. They need to be disciplined. And this is what's really interesting. And the discipline for him, for the soldier, is extremely important. This is basic rules. Forget all you learned in school. There's nothing to do. Nobody cares. He actually says this. I mean, we were taught, whatever, Kant, Hegel, read this, philosophy, history, what Caesar did. Nobody cares. What's important is to tie your shoes well, polish them, wear your uniform. These are the important things. The same thing we've been noticing with schools. Kids being locked out of schools. Suddenly, what was the most important thing personally, if I left school for I think it was 4 days, you had to bring a medical certificate. You had to prove that there was a valid reason for you not to be in school. And now kids have not been going to school and again, allegedly, but I would claim this whole distance schooling, it is cool, but it's a fracture of it. This is all being justified. And suddenly the new rules is not about do your homework. Your new rules is, everybody has heard these repeatedly, every supermarket, every politician, wash your hands, wear the mask, social distancing. These are the new rules. This is what you need to do to be self-disciplined. This is what you need to survive. Now, we all know when Foucault talks a lot about discipline, he's actually mentioning docility. So docility is discipline for him. And I might want to conclude there that as I mentioned, the idea is you follow the rules, everybody's going to survive. Wear the uniform, fight for your country, get to the end, and you will be prized, possibly with victory. This image here loaded is quite interesting into this. I found this yesterday. So it's the idea of self-control. So Malaysians, I found this on the government website in Malaysia. So these are the people who are responding fine. So who is doing this in the right way? 93% of the people are wearing it willingly. 93.8% have told their parents to do so, family members. And then you see, have you told other people to do it? 57% have told strangers to do it. So are you following the rules? Are you actually behaving in the right way? Have you worn the uniform? And again, to conclude, how Remarque has pointed out, when you take the uniform off, when you go home and you think that everything has finished and we're all fine, what is really happening? What is it really over? And here you go. This, as he said, his book was trying to simply tell a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped the shells, they were destroyed by war. Thank you. I hope that was concise.
Thank you, Janos. We have two discussants, Harald Vidra and Roger Griffin. They are both here. So Harald, maybe you start.
Well, thank you very much, Janos. What a wonderful idea you have, as always. And I really enjoyed that, the theme and also the comparative nature of it, and especially that you go back to Remarque is a fantastic idea. And what I have here is just basically full of praise. I also like the fact that you somehow problematize that, especially the little paragraph on the food and the shelter, and the, I sort of like, I don't know, they call it positive aspect or the compensation or the flight into, and how you make sort of like these comparisons. That's lovely. So I have some ideas, and even sort of like, I know, a darker side to it in a way, because on the one hand, you could actually read, you could start from Remarque and go, because one of the things is, on the one hand, it's the mediation, sort of like what are people told about enemies and how invisible these enemies are. And they can actually spin that further and say, well, there was the interwar period, but the interwar period was full of invisible enemies, the so-called, you know, Nazism and fascism fed on them. The Jews, the capitalists, everybody could become an internal enemy. Then after World War II, you have the Cold War. So now the war is over, but we wake up and now, you know, we have new enemies and they can annihilate us immediately with nuclear weapons. I mean, I can talk about it because I lived in Germany at the front line, and I can tell you in the 1980s, which now looks for many people as a sort of like, wow, great period, everything was stable. I mean, many people were dead afraid. The 1980s were much more difficult than the 1960s and 1970s in terms of nuclear danger. And after that, you woke up and said, well, actually, the USSR was actually at its feet already. You know, they were just bankrupt. I'm not saying, of course, that these threats didn't exist, as much as you could say, okay, North Korea is building, has already a nuclear weapon, but we are sort of like led into this kind of, you know, invisible enemy out there, and you can hardly do anything about it because it's mediated in you. There is a sort of, there is a kernel of truth to it, of course, but of course it's blown up. Not to talk about the war on terror. I mean, you know, we've already forgotten that for 20 years before the pandemic, we've lived on that. You know, a bomb may explode any instance, you know, in the next market square. Again, some truth to it, but of course turned into a spiral of self-fulfilling almost. I wanted to, so in a way, if you wanted to work further on that, you could basically, you know, you could turn it into a, you know, there are several other comparative aspects to it, but I come back to Remarque in a minute. The thing, you know, the title Investen nichts Neues is actually something that was, you know, that was written in the papers. So it's actually a reference to how most of the young German people who were not in the trenches were living that war. That was a big adventure. So they would run to the kiosk to get the paper. What has happened? You know, have we conquered new spaces? Have we made advances of some kilometers? Have we been pushed back? This is actually the generation that made Nazism. Those people who were not in the trenches, I mean, Hitler, okay, he was, but he wasn't for a long time, right? He was wounded, so he was ejected, and then he continued living that as the adventure that in the end was stolen from us. So the victory was stolen from us. So I think the point is that there was a mediation about that. Most of the young people who were just not old enough to go into the trenches had lived there and had, you know, woken up in 1918 and said, what has happened? Somebody has stolen it from us, right? So I think that's the point that in a way relates to the pandemic as well. It's the mediation of a conflict, of the invisible enemy. I mean, in that case, the enemy is sort of real, right? But the thing is that the states and the governments had actually taken up something more. It's not the medics, I think, who are the military. It's the state governments who have become a kind of military command operation. I think I was thinking spontaneously about Elias Canetti's book, Masse und Macht, Crowds and Power, where he has this image of the sting, of the order. The command is the sting that sits in the soldiers, right? When you were showing the statistics about Malaysia, you know, the percentage of the people who behave nicely, sort of like, you know, you almost, I mean, of course, it's not exactly the thing that when you're in a trench or the officer tells you to go to attack, you do it, right? There are, of course, there is more margin of maneuver, I think, in society. I mean, most people do it, right? But there are still some who don't. And I remember the video Daniel sent me about the guy in Florence, you know, who didn't want to wear a mask, and there were 5 policemen around him, trying to put him, basically putting him to the ground. Do you remember that, Daniel? So that was sort of like the intervention of the Italian police in, close to the Duomo in Florence to basically make him comply. But I think that these are the relevant, or some relevant ideas to bring that together, the mediation of the conflict, but especially the second reality that also sort of built up, This enemy is always there. It seems as if we've been living for 100 years or more in a constant, kind of semi-permanent suggestion that there are invisible enemies alive in order to give us certain stability. I mean, of course, Schmidt's ideas about friend enemy come into mind, but I think it's more complicated and it's more insidious, the way it is related to civil society. I could talk on for longer, but I'm very conscious of time, so I leave it there. Thank you.
That's great. Roger, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, yeah, great paper, and I taught Remarque at Oxford, and I found it really strange. So I think the response would be different now. How the Oxbridge students that I was teaching couldn't relate to it at all. I mean, there's this cliche in English that the past is an undiscovered territory, and it's a foreign land. And I mean, I think American professors find the same thing about Vietnam, things that seem incredibly real. I don't know how much the younger generation can relate to it at all, and maybe the COVID experience will help them make sense of certain things. But I wanted to highlight a book that I really missed in your presentation, though it's not meant to be a critique. Eric Lead, No Man's Land, Combat and Identity in World War I. And I just want to read out a phrase from this is just the blurb on the Amazon site. So this is not my scholarship, it's complete opposite. But listen, Professor Lead looks at how the traumatic experience of combat itself and the wholesale shattering of the conventions and ethical codes of normal social life turned ordinary citizens into liminal people, men living beyond the limits of the accepted and expected. And so a central theme of the book is liminality. And if we're going to push these allegorical or metaphorical links between Remarque's study of the First World War and the pandemic, the things that scream out at me is one, his account of how time changed in the trenches. And there's this phrase, the foot soldiers of the war, well, I've said this, and the COVID of the COVID pandemic are exposed to, quote, a protracted boredom as they long for the end of the war, which is the great unlocking, of course, but which for some could end in sudden death or injury. And there's this strange unreality. We're waiting for an unlocking, but people are dying. And that ambivalent experience of time is, I think, a very interesting parallel, the temporal dimension of waiting for Godot while actors in the play are being suddenly blown up or dying of diseases, etc. Also, he stresses in the book, and this is a quote from the book itself, the way ordinary civilians suddenly found themselves, quote, having the sense of being in a process rather than a place, in an interregnum with no definable structure. Now, I find that interesting because of this. In a sense, we gave a narrative shape to the first wave. I mean, even in Britain this time last year, which handled the whole crisis disgustingly badly, but there was a sense by the summer that it was a single wave. And that does remind me of the First World War, because people were always thinking it was going to be over by Christmas. And in fact, there were a whole load of waves of warfare. And also the way the waiting for Godot element, also this liminality produced palingenetic expectations of renewal. So that, for example, I'm very interested in the fact that there have been a whole load of debates on BBC Radio about what the post-COVID state, and whether we can use it as the trigger to finally solve our ecological crisis and create social justice, etc., etc. Now, an interesting case study for you is Wyndham Lewis, who became obsessed with the frontline experience, and he ended up being an apologist for Nazism. But in 1921, he created a new cultural periodical called the Tyro, Tyro. And in his introduction to it, this is a quote from the introduction: "We're at the beginning of a new epoch, the creatures of a new state of human life, as different from the 19th century England as the Renaissance was from the Middle Ages." And I think that of course it wasn't. That's the trouble. I mean, instead of there being a nice, brave new world, the interwar period got worse and worse. But the interesting thing for me is that these longings for a new order are floating around in the experience. Even this conference can be seen as a way of investigating liminality and renewal in a funny sort of way. But we're now no longer so optimistic about the form that some of those renewals will take. Now, this wonderful metaphor of no man's land, which is one of the great cliches of liminality. I find it interesting that the French use the English no man's land. The Italians say terra di nessuno, Germans niemandsland. But the idea of a physical space between enemy lines, which was dangerous, and which I mean, I don't know if you've seen the film 2017, which, have you seen that, Janos? The film 2017?
The film 2017? No, I have not.
Oh, no, sorry, 1917. No, 2017 is my...
No, I haven't. No, I haven't that one either. No, I have not. I know
oh, well, it is entirely filmed in the liminal space. But I just wanted to finish on this point, that originally I thought the word no man's land was a product of the First World War. But in fact, historically, it was the name for the dumping ground of rubbish between two fiefdoms. So when you had petty princes with their own area, the bit between them, the borderline between the two fiefdoms, was where everybody dumped their shit. Yeah. Now, I don't know if you've seen the cartoon Wall-E, which is all about the idea that the planet itself has become a dumping ground and the whole of the planet is just a rubbish heap. I do like the idea that the sort of the ecological crisis we've got is like some of my students at Oxford, when they lost control of tidiness and their rooms were just what we call in English a tip. Yeah. And we've somehow collectively as a species turned our planet into a sort of tip. And there's a liminality of space. There's something about tidiness and disorder. And I think what we're going to see towards the end of the COVID crisis, if we can ever get there, are a whole load of projects of renewal. But I have learned from studying the interwar period that most of these projects either turn into something very evil or just don't happen. So I end with this comment. In 1909, an unknown pundit declared that history is one damn thing after another. And I would suggest that if we ever transition to a post-COVID age, modern liminality will continue unabated on a downhill entropic trajectory. Stephen Dedalus in James Joyce's great modernist exploration of the desperation of the artist to find an aesthetic escape from the anomie of modernity, the portrait of the artist as a young man, famously commented that history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. I believe that after COVID, as after 1918, modern time will continue to deny the possibility of catharsis, of anagnoris, of closure, of resolution, and that even our eco-apocalypse will be more of a protracted whimper than a bang, with no collective awakening from the nightmare we have created till it is too late and we move towards an environmental equivalent of the Second World War. Now that's me last night being very pessimistic, but I would recommend you, if you want to turn this, your paper into a brilliant article, please look at Lead, because it's a book that I think acquires an enormous resonance now in the context of a crisis which I don't think he could possibly have foreseen, where millions of ordinary citizens are now in a sort of Zoom trench, waiting either for death or for a great unlocking of an armistice from disease. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Can I just comment on Harald and Roger together? Do I have 2 minutes? No, yeah. That's fantastic. Indeed, the point of the article was exactly the title that I thought it was amazing. Nothing new in the West. Exactly. This was the point, that this is happening all over again. And why there's a paragraph in my chapter that I mentioned about the idea of allegedly, because I don't want to sound too controversial, but indeed, like the First World War exploded after a series of events, and Harald can help me here. He's much more of a historian than me, but after a series of events, of provocations, at a certain point, the war happened, and the same way, this coronavirus, this COVID-19, well, the symptoms called COVID-19 followed a series of sicknesses that we have all heard of, from the swine flu and whatnot, were all suggested that would make millions of deaths, which did not. And then we came to this, which was some sort of, well, okay, let's get over it. It appears almost. So nothing new in the West is that this is a repetitive thing. This is happening again. You mentioned this idea of liminal people living in trenches, and indeed in the article, it was, I wanted to write more on that, but then I kind of caught up with other things. But indeed, it's very interesting, this parallel between the people living in trenches and the people living locked in their home. And what's interesting, what I noticed is Remarque says that, normally, being joyful about being able of cooking your own bread at home would have been ridiculous. It would have been some kind of completely trivial topic of conversation among people. Like, okay, whatever, you watch a good movie, you bake your own bread, I don't know, let's talk about something else. But then it became something amazing, that it became the central thing of a lot of families and whatnot. What kind of food did you bake? There's nothing else to do, let's bake our own food. Fantastic. And Remarque says, well, the same thing happened during the war. I mean, instead of reading interesting books or talking about culture, the only thing you can think about is, where are we going to eat? What are we going to eat? Who are we going to steal our chickens from so we can have a great dinner? And that's the only thing that matters for them, because who knows, you're going to die tomorrow. So let's just enjoy the moment. And Remarque says, well, this is the end of civilization, because this, when these are the only thing you think about, where is all civilization going? And so that's some of that. And so indeed, this comment you make about no man's land is quite amazing, and the only comment I can give to that is, it pops to my head, is the Wonder Woman movie that came out, and I saw just a few months ago. There's a scene where they are in the trenches in the First World War. It's set there, and she wants to.
If we can wrap it up, yeah.
Yeah, I'm closing it here. So she wants to jump over the fences and help them to fight off the Germans, and they say, hey, wait a minute, don't go there, it's a no man's land. And she says, but I'm not a man. So and that's how she fights them. So this is what I'm saying, that maybe this is changing somehow, but it still is out there, it still is a no man's land, and still I'm still seeing zombies walking around, if I can call them that way. And I repeat, I don't know if the vaccine is going to change it. It's the zombie's still going to be there, because we've been forced to see them that way for the last year and a half. But thank you very much.
Thank you.